This is a Virginia Museum of Veiled History production, copyright 2017, Social Justice Connections, LLC, written by Larry Lamar Yates. This is the story of Virginia's great constitutional coup of 1902. And already that sounds hard to believe. Virginia never had a coup, did it? And if Virginia did have a coup, it would have been during the Civil War or the Revolution or possibly even the Civil Rights Movement. But not in 1902. In 1902, men were wearing derby hats, starched collars. The Wright brothers were flying their ridiculous machine down in North Carolina. It's just not the kind of time we have a coup. Well, it did happen. And not only did it happen, but half the voters in the state of Virginia lost their vote as a result of the coup. And the whole structure of Virginia politics was locked into place for 60 years to come. How did this happen? Well, it helps to back up and look at the whole United States. The Civil War had been over for a while, and Northern whites had stopped really being that concerned about the situation of the folks who had been enslaved. And a lot of Southern whites were very interested in regaining control of those people in any way they could. So 1902 was not a good time to be a liberal or be black or be generally not a fan of the Confederate approach to life in Virginia. But the people who did have that Confederate approach didn't quite feel that things were going, at least not enough. They were concerned that at every election they had to cheat and steal votes. They had to? Well, that's how they saw it. You see, if they didn't cheat and they didn't steal votes, then black people might influence, black men, I should say, might influence the outcome of the elections. And to some white Virginians, elite white Virginians, having black men influence elections amounted to having black men in charge. You see, if, say, 15 or 20% of the electorate was black, they could be the deciding factor in which way the election went. And this was just plain unacceptable to the elite. They were tired of cheating. They were tired of worrying about black folks and black votes. They'd had enough. And the same sentiment, of course, existed around the South. Other states, Mississippi was, I think, the first, had also had their constitutional conventions and changed their constitutions to make it essentially impossible for black people to vote. So it was time for Virginia to do the same thing. And in 1902, a constitutional convention gathered in Richmond. That convention was controlled by the Democratic Party. Of course, the Democratic Party in those days in Virginia was the conservative party, the party of the former slave owners, of the wealthy, of the segregationists. And they had 88 of the 100 votes in the convention. Carter Glass was a key person in the convention, and he later went on to be a United States Senator from Virginia, Secretary of the Treasury, and in general a very powerful person in Washington as well as in Virginia. When the discussion of limiting the vote came up at the convention, the word discrimination was raised. For you see, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were still in place. And under those amendments, it was illegal to take the vote away on the basis of race. But Carter Glass spoke up on the floor and he said, discriminate? We were elected to discriminate. We were elected to reduce the black vote as much as possible without reducing the white vote. Well, that didn't work too well. The convention struggled with this approach and that approach to reduce the black vote and finally realized that they were going to also reduce the white vote. And they really weren't that unhappy about. This was a convention of mostly wealthy people, many of them already in office. And they didn't mind taking the vote away from a bunch of poor white people that they didn't really trust anyway. So the result of their work, which took about a year, the result was a constitution that would end up taking the vote away from about half the men in the state. Yes, this was before women were voting. And from almost all the black people in the state. Now, a question probably arises in your mind. Don't constitutions go to a referendum of the people? And why would the people, in this case being the male voters, agree to a constitution that took the vote away from half of them? It doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't. And you and I were not the only ones to figure this out. The convention members figured it out too. And they came up with an interesting solution. Now, just to back up, the Democratic Party, which controlled the convention, had said 2 years beforehand, when they were calling for a convention, that the convention would take the Constitution to a vote of the people. And that's what always had been done with previous Virginia constitutions, just as it was done with every constitution since. But the boys in 1902 decided to try something different. So they proclaimed the Constitution they had written. They took away the votes of half the voters of Virginia without letting them get a chance to have a say. And after the convention proclaimed the Constitution, and don't ask me what that means legally, I don't know, nobody else did either. But after they did it, the governor, the General Assembly, the Virginia Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, the President of the United States all said, sounds good to me. And there it was, proclaimed. People tried to go to court to fight it. Supreme Court, state and federal, said, you're out of luck. And so Virginia lived with that Constitution until a new one came into effect in 1971. What did it do to the vote? I'm going to simplify a little. We have a publication that goes into this in strict detail. But basically, voters ended up in one of three categories. If they were a veteran of the Civil War or a son of the veteran of the Civil War, they could register immediately. If they owned $300 worth of property that they paid taxes to the state on, and that was a fairly good chunk of property in those days. If they did, then they could register, no questions asked. For everybody else, there was some kind of process of writing about the Constitution, making clear that they understood it. Now, of course, many Virginians were illiterate in those days, especially black Virginians. But that really wasn't enough because, again, if you go back to the floor of the convention, one of the delegates said, again, speaking openly, it's on the record, that he was sure that the understanding of black men would not be tested in as friendly a way as the understanding of white men. Finally, there was the poll tax. You had to pay a $1.50 poll tax before you could vote. There was no bill sent to you to pay it. You had to pay it 3 years in a row before you could vote. A lot of people got their poll tax paid for them by one of the parties. For those who didn't, this was not an insignificant amount of money if you lived pretty much all year without any cash at all, which is what many poor farmers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and so on did in Virginia. And of course, if all that was not enough to discourage you, there was just plain discouragement. If you worked for a white man, you were black, that white man probably did not want you to vote. If you rented from a white man, the same thing was probably true. And even if you were a poor white man, it was pretty likely that your betters would be willing to say that they would take care of you if anything came up, and there really was no need for you to try to vote. When the Constitution went into effect in 1902, a man named Thomas Martin, a railroad lawyer, lobbyist, politician, soon a United States Senator, was essentially running the state of Virginia. And that Constitution certainly locked his power into place. He had to please a much smaller group, and the smaller group he had to please were people like him. He lasted another 15 years or so, his 20 years, and then his successor, Harry Flood Byrd Sr., came to power in 1926 and stayed in power until 1965. That 40-year control of the state of Virginia would not have been possible without the 1902 Constitution. And of course, Harry Byrd was not the only beneficiary of the 1902 Constitution. Walter Harrison was a judge and had been a state senator from here in Winchester and was a delegate to the convention. So he was one of those who was so happy with what he and his friends came up with that they proclaimed it. What happened as a result of that to him? Well, soon after, he became a congressman with the active support of Harry Flood Byrd. He was a congressman on and off for about 15 years. And then his son followed in his footsteps, had the same judgeship, and ended up in the same seat in Congress. Altogether, the two of them had about 30 years in Congress, time that they got largely because Harrison Sr. had proclaimed the 1902 Constitution with his pals. Even though many of them went on to hold high political office, the people who served in the 1902 Constitution can't be seen as statesmen, can't be seen as the noble Virginians they believed they were. These men, the majority of the convention, were quite simply crooks. There was no basis for taking the vote away from anybody in Virginia, except that they were annoyed, they were unhappy, that they wanted more control. Legally, every black man, every white man had the right to vote. That right had been fought for, and blood had soaked the soil of Virginia in order to achieve that right. And there continued to be struggles after the war. But finally, this was the peaceful coup that resolved it all. It took away the vote from most Virginians for 40, 50, 60 years, and that kept a couple of characters who were no better than they should be in power. That's our history. It's not pretty. There were people who fought it. There were people who pointed it out while it was happening. And there are people who have done a lot in the 20th century to correct the problem. We have people to be proud of, but we also have a shameful legacy of crooked politics of the worst kind. Nor should we pretend that it's all been washed away, that it's not with us anymore. There are still plenty of attempts to discourage and limit the vote of people that don't have a lot of wealth and don't have a lot of power. Let's keep our eyes open. Let's remember where we live and who's still in charge. Thanks.